As the drums of war grow louder under Xi Jinping's third term, we explore how the U.S. is supporting Taiwan in beefing up its self-defense capabilities. We look at what it takes for Taiwan to effectively build deterrence against a Chinese invasion and the anticipated role of like-minded democratic allies in the event of a Taiwan contingency. Hi, and welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news and analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Liao.
I'm Rath Wang. Joining us in the studio today is William Stanton, former de facto U.S. ambassador to Taiwan in his capacity as the director of the American Institute in Taiwan, AIT. Ambassador Stanton is a seasoned diplomat and currently chair professor in the International College of Innovation at National Chengchi University, and Huang Kwei-bo, associate professor of diplomacy, also at National Chengchi University. Professor Huang is a renowned expert in international relations. Glad to have you both back. I spoke earlier to Rick Fisher, Senior Fellow on Asian Military Affairs at the International Assessment and Strategy Center. Rick is an expert on PRC and Asian security and is the author of China's Military Modernization, Building for Regional and Global Reach. And I also spoke earlier to Riley Walters, Deputy Director of the Japan Chair at the think tank Hudson Institute. Riley is an expert on both Japan and Korea ties with the United States. Both Rick and Riley are based in the Washington, D.C. area. We'd first like to discuss the simmering cross-strait situation between Taiwan and China and what role the U.S. plays in ensuring regional peace and stability. First, we'd like to start with you, Ambassador. There seems to be a lot of hype around, defense of Taiwan and whether the U.S. will come to its support or not. Yeah. For our international viewers, can you talk about what that means for Taiwan, as President Biden mentioned many times that he would militarily defend Taiwan and is coming up with this new red line with China? What specifically is that red line?
Well, the way I interpret it is that based on the statements he made, 3 statements in 2021, and then a statement more recently in this year, and also the statements when the State Department last year revised its Taiwan policy online. And then there was a rejoinder from the PRC. And then the spokesperson for the State Department responded to that. All of that led me to the conclusion that, in fact, the Biden administration has been very clear that if China takes military action against Taiwan, that would be a red line. In one case, he said, that's a commitment we've made, in effect. He said, same with Japan, same with South Korea, same for Taiwan. So I think he puts them in that group of allies that if there's military action taken of any kind, I would think, I don't think it necessarily has to be boots on the ground or an attempted invasion, because many people have looked at the situation and assumed that there are many alternatives that the PRC has to actually a direct attack.
You're saying that Taiwan has been put practically in the same level as Japan, Korea, in terms of being a non-NATO ally, whereas those are NATO allies.
I mean, we have other allies like Israel, for example. And in a way, the situation Israel faces in terms of its neighborhood has always been under threat. But they have nuclear weapons. Taiwan does not. As I recall, historically, I guess Taiwan was developing them and said, no, you can't do that. The U.S. stopped it. So I think the U.S. should do more. I'm just not very optimistic about that. They've both made it pretty clear that they're not going to back down from their positions. And I think both sides, well, particularly certainly China, believes that it's got the upper hand. And frankly, some of the things that they're talking about that might be offers from the U.S. to try to solve the sad state of relations between our two countries, I think are non-starters. I personally would not support resumed military talks. When I was in Beijing, the 6 years I spent there, We had rounds of talks where people would come, and I never thought that the talks really achieved very much. I think some of the military liked it because they get to see the face of a potential enemy. But climate change, I think there's too strong a disagreement on what approaches should be taken. So they may think that's a soft subject where we can make progress, but I don't think so. So if nothing comes out of these talks, as I suspect, I think we're right back where we were before with a threatening PRC and with Taiwan that I think I would like to now at this point see, given the fact that Biden has spoken, as you said, 4 times, but the State Department has also spoken. And as I wrote in an essay for Taiwan News last August this year, nobody really took it as being strategically clear. So I think it's about time, perhaps, that we should embrace what people would call strategic clarity and say, this is what we're going to do. So that might be one outcome. If, in fact, there's absolutely no progress, maybe both sides will issue statements. But that, unfortunately, won't make the situation any calmer. So in the meantime, my continuing hope is that Taiwan will do more. Also to prepare. I mean, one of the things that's helped Ukraine so much, has gotten so much U.S. support and allied support, has been that the Ukrainians themselves were so ready to go to war.
We'll go definitely into detail in the next section on this.
So we've been talking about a red line, and that's one of the things that have come up surrounding Taiwan-China relations, or as well with the U.S., this triangle. But another term that we hear a lot, like Director Stanton just said, is strategic ambiguity. And whereas Director Stanton is calling for more strategic clarity, strategic ambiguity traditionally is how U.S.-Taiwan relations were kind of dictated, in that the U.S. does not commit one way or the other for a myriad of reasons. But Professor Huang, I'd like your opinion on this. Do you think that the U.S. is going towards more of a direction towards strategic clarity with all these new developments, these new, what seem like unambiguous statements? This flat out to me looks like there's no way you can just say Biden's 4 times were ambiguity. It's not ambiguous at all. So Professor, what's your insight on this?
Except Joe Biden's 4-time statements on the possibility of military intervention in the Taiwan Strait, I think the main theme upheld by the US government in general is still ambiguity. Because ambiguity now serves the best interests of the US, in my mind, mainly because the US, I think, has lost the golden timing to deter the PRC militarily. But on the other hand, the US is still very, very capable of deterring the forces of Taiwan independence on Taiwan. So let's talk a little bit about US PRC. Because as I said, say in the 1990s, when the third Taiwan Strait crisis happened, the US was capable of sending 2 aircraft carriers to the waters near Taiwan, or some people say one of the aircraft even cruised through the Taiwan Strait, while the PRC almost did do nothing militarily to counter the US responses. Why? Because the US was very capable militarily. But nowadays, I believe you have heard a lot of experts on this area talking about the losing advantage of the US, especially when the PRC's A2AD anti-access area denial capability is been growing. And I think that's true. I'm not saying that the US is going to lose a battle or lose a war against the PRC, but within the first island chain, I think the US advantage is strengthening. And perhaps, that's why I said that the timing for the U.S. to demonstrate strategic clarity has passed. But the U.S., if the U.S. can continue to use this ambiguity to tell Taiwan not to be de jure independent and to tell Beijing not to use force against Taiwan, then I think this is not only militarily feasible, but also diplomatically possible. So I don't know whether or not people can have even a better idea as to how the U.S. can handle this, rising tension in the Taiwan Strait. But maybe strategic ambiguity, if it's broken, why fix it? Oh, unless you think it's broken already.
We have an interview with Rick Fisher moving on, but I just want to follow up really quickly on something that Professor Huang said. You said that the U.S. missed this strategic, this golden timing where it could kind of, what's it called, just control the PRC's military advancement. When would you give that golden timing? What was that time frame, would you say, in your mind? That golden timing that
probably before 2010, roughly. I think the U.S. was militarily superior to the PRC. But after 2010, I think the PRC has been developing a lot of missiles and advanced aircrafts, and also its frigates and the PLA Navy is growing so rapidly that the U.S. is losing its advantage over the PRC in military sense.
Okay. You did mention an advantage, but do you feel that the U.S. still has this superior stance against the PRC?
Right.
But
in
it's
general,
losing its influence,
but if
is what you're trying
focusing on the region or the area, say the Taiwan Strait, maybe the U.S. or the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance may not be able to gain advantage over the PRC.
We'll talk a bit more about that in the next section. We just spoke about rising tensions in the Taiwan Strait as Xi Jinping continues to threaten Taiwan with military drills and how Washington's policy has evolved. Let's now hear from Rick Fisher, Senior Fellow on Asian Military Affairs at the International Assessment and Strategy Center in Washington, D.C. Rick spoke to me about the defense items Taiwan should procure from the U.S. in effectively deterring a Chinese invasion. Let's take a look.
Well, first and foremost, anti-tank missiles like the Javelin, an effective combat-proven weapon that has helped the Ukraine to turn the tide of battle against Russia, but also larger missiles. Taiwan already has the ability to produce a decent medium-range surface-to-air missile. The United States should be selling Taiwan very long-range anti-aircraft missiles so that Taiwan can shoot down China's H-6K bombers before they get into range to launch land attack cruise missiles and now new hypersonic air-launched ballistic missiles that we saw for the first time at the Zhuhai show. And beyond that, the United States does not yet have an effective anti-ship ballistic missile to offer Taiwan, but it could in the next 2 to 3 years. As this weapon is developed and as a production capability comes online, the United States should be reproducing that production capability in Taiwan. Taiwan needs thousands of long-range, at least 1,000-kilometer range ballistic missiles that can attack gathering Chinese invasion nodes along the coast and to take out the thousands of military and mainly civilian transport ferries, barges that will be carrying the bulk of the invasion. Not just one wave, but multiple waves of troops to Taiwan. 1,000 missiles may only be able to deal with the first wave. The United States is going to have to be able to ship hundreds and thousands of these missiles to Taiwan very quickly, meaning the United States and Japan especially must create stockpiles of these missiles on the islands, Japanese islands very close to Taiwan, so that they can be shipped to Taiwan immediately.
You talked a lot about the different weapons and articles that Taiwan should procure and also work with Japan to be able to deter or fend off a Chinese invasion. How would you see these articles coming in, and how can we speed up the process so that Taiwan can get them in time?
The range of theater missiles that began development during the Trump administration are now only slated to reach the field. It may only be deployed in Asia to deter China within the next 2 to 3, maybe even 4 years. This is too late. China will be tempted to launch an invasion while it has a relative level of superiority on the Taiwan Strait. The missiles that the United States is developing and will soon put into production will greatly reduce China's level of superiority. So Xi Jinping is heavily tempted to contemplate to begin his invasion campaign probably within the next 2 years. Within the next year is, by this logic, would be even more optimal. So for the United States, the issue is right now undertaking the kind of airlift that we undertook in, I believe, 1971-72 to aid Israel in the Yom Kippur War. We need to be sending hundreds of civilian 747 transport aircraft loaded with munitions to build up Taiwan's stocks. Thousands of Javelin anti-tank missiles, precision-guided artillery rockets. According to open sources, the United States has produced over 3,000 of the 300 to 400 kilometer range ATACMS ballistic missile. We've agreed to sell 64 to Taiwan. We should probably be shipping 600 to Taiwan right now. That kind of act is what is required to get Xi Jinping's attention, to convey to him that, whoa, I might not win. I might not be able to take Taiwan.
We just heard from Rick Fisher talk to Rath Wang about weapons Taiwan needs to procure from the U.S. in order to have sufficient military capabilities in deterring against a Chinese takeover. Let's now talk about what these items mean and how Taiwan can get there. Director Stanton, we heard Rick Fisher talk about long-range capability for Taiwan. Is that necessary when Taiwan is seen to be in the defensive position? Because long-range to me sounds like more of an attack item than it is a defensive item.
Well, the Taiwan Strait is 130 kilometers. So once the ships launch, once the attack is underway, you'll know it anyway from radar, it would, you could reach with longer range missiles, you could want to reach the aircraft and ships before they get anywhere close to the island. That's why I thought it was a little bit odd that he said, anti-tank missiles, because that presumes the tanks have already landed or are in the process of landing. That doesn't make much sense to me. In the same way, frankly, when there was an order that I understood that Taiwan was interested in buying tanks, and I think they've now moved in a different direction, because if you're preparing for a tank battle, where is that going to take place? It's going to take place in Taiwan. That means the troops have already arrived from China. So, I prefer longer range, mid-range missiles. I'm all for that. I'm also for other steps that, Taiwan could take. I think if you're going to buy all this stuff, or the U.S. is going to donate it in some way, we're going to need I think the defense budget in Taiwan is still only about 1.2% of GDP. Israel is 4%, which is, analogous in some ways, except for how much we're spending on defense. And I would like to see also, there still has been no move, probably for political reasons, domestic political reasons, but 4 months conscription is just too little. I mean, I think we have to prepare Taiwan people for the fact that, you know, we may be in this fight. And so, and I've talked to students of mine, and they've gone for the 4-month conscription program, and they basically don't think much of it. I mean, in some cases, they've only fired a few bullets. In some cases, they haven't fired a rifle at all. They haven't learned how to clear a jammed rifle. So I think, you know, in Israel, for example, every man and woman winds up serving. That's not inconceivable here. I've been to facilities in Taiwan where women are serving in many roles at various bases. And they do a great job because, for example, if their job is watching a radar screen, women are more attentive to detail, they're more assiduous, and in many ways they can serve their country and still you know, work a 9 to 5 hour, or, you know, at least set hours, you know, divided up among the day. So I would like to see Taiwan do a little bit more than just buy weapons. And I think there's, you know, I think Taiwan needs to talk with people in the U.S. military about what they think would be most useful if the U.S. also comes into the fight. Because we don't want something that's going to be redundant, particularly, but it depends on whether the U.S. would, what timing the U.S. would have. How long would Taiwan have to resist? How quickly would our troops get here? I don't know those details. You know, how much time would it take? So, you know, in addition to resuming talks, which has been muted in the press, with Xi Jinping to resume military talks with the PRC, I would like to see us have even more intense, although maybe they're already occurring, talks with the Taiwan military and our military for mutual planning and discussion.
You talked about Taiwan doing a bit more. Professor, I wanted to get the Taiwan perspective on this. Do you feel that the U.S. should, in terms of military defense capabilities, actually provide Taiwan, say, lease technology so that Taiwan can actually produce its own by not just relying on arms from the U.S.?
In fact, since 1949, the Republic of China has been largely dependent on the U.S. for self-defense and survival. So your question is actually, I mean, yes, Taiwan should work with the U.S. for the acquisition of more advanced weaponry systems. And I think Taiwan needs to also think that, as we just put, what kind of weaponry system Taiwan really needs. We don't want something redundant. We don't want something that's very, very expensive, like ripped off. And we don't want something that is huge, gorgeous, but not very practical on the battlefields on the island of Taiwan. So what exactly does Taiwan want? And to my best knowledge, sometimes, yes, the two sides, I mean Taiwan and US, their officials or officers would communicate on this kind of specific issue. But some other times, I think the voice of Taiwan might have been downplayed by Washington because Washington would like to instruct Taiwan, this is what you want. Do that, as I said, because I know better than you do.
Such as we've seen in the Taiwan Policy Act, with parts of it saying, dictating which items Taiwan should.
Yes, Americans can be very bad diplomats.
But what would you see as beneficial to Taiwan's defense in 2022? What do you feel would deter the PLA in terms of strategy? As Leslie mentioned earlier, defensive. What do you see Taiwan needing to?
Well, I guess my iteration of this question is, Professor Huang, you said, you know, what Taiwan wants, but what does Taiwan need from your point of view?
Actually, now we're having a big debate in Taiwan society as to what we really need. So the overall defense concept raised by some former officers in the ROC Army or of the armed forces. But for some other people in Taiwan, they think all we need is to maintain sufficient deterrence capability, not exactly like men serving in the army, or we acquired a lot of defensive weapons articles from the U.S. They think we have to talk about what do we mean by sufficient deterrence capability, and that's very subjective.
It could be porcupine, it could be asymmetric,
or maybe less than that. So what I mean that in Taiwan, I think we need some public discussions to talk about what do we mean by sufficient deterrence capability. Then we can have a more unified stance to speak to our American friends. Hey, this is what we think useful in the future battlefields on Taiwan. Otherwise, I think I've heard so many different voices in Taiwan about, hey, this is what we want. Hey, that's what we really want. But we are not that rich. I think it's okay to spend more on national defense, but we cannot afford too much because we are facing not an equal rivalry or competitor, but a military growing mainland China. And it's actually, I have to say, even if we spend 10% of our GDP on our defense, still the PRC, Liberation Army, is still superior to Taiwan's armed forces. So we have to think smartly as to what we should do, not only about our internal discussion, but also our communication with our American friends.
Good, Professor, you're saying that conversation hasn't started. We need to initiate that. There have been a lot of talks and also analysts from all over the world saying that China needs a few years to catch up with the U.S. So there's still some time, but there's not a lot of time left.
In terms of time, of course, time is running out. And I think it's a little bit too late and too little to do this ODC, overall defense concept in Taiwan. But some people say better than nothing. So that's why I said, hey, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, can we sit down and talk about our national defense strategy as a kind of consensus representing Taiwan? Then we can know better what we really want. But also, I would like to emphasize that even though we have our own wish list, but in Washington, D.C., it's not the DoD defense that can determine everything. To my best knowledge, now the decision procedure has to go up to a joint panel of National Security Council and State Department. So they are going to decide, okay, this is, say, defensive articles, and this is very good for asymmetric warfare for Taiwan. Okay, so this can be sold to Taiwan. So this is a very complicated decision process in Washington, D.C., which Taiwan has no control over.
You mentioned no control, and for Ambassador Stanton, do you feel that with Biden and his so-called doing better than what they thought of the Democrats in terms of, Republicans with this midterm,
right?
Do we feel that there will be more support for Taiwan, and do you feel that this process will be alleviated in terms of procuring arms or facilitating this discussion in general?
Well, I think what the recent elections showed, with the Biden is in a stronger position right now. But I think the one thing that both Republicans and Democrats agree on now, where there's mutual support, is defense of Taiwan. I think there's been a real shift from when I was AIT Director or before when I served in China. Back in those days, long ago, the whole idea was how can we improve our relationship with China? China's important. We need to have more dialogue, do more things. And it was really a fool's game because we were basically doing things that gave China the time and the ability, and often the technology, to improve their strength. And meanwhile, Taiwan was an afterthought. I think that's all changed now. Now, China increasingly is perceived as a great threat, along with Russia, to U.S. interests and to our interests and to our allies in East Asia and in Europe. And I think there's more of a willingness to do whatever is necessary to try to change the current equation that the Chinese are using when they think about a possible invasion. I agree that political consensus is needed in Taiwan. We used to say when I was in Australia that the phrase was, a book was written, Taiwan the lucky country. I sometimes think I would write a book about Taiwan called The Happy Country. Because one of the problems Taiwan has, even when I talk to our students and about service to the country and what they would do, everybody's very comfortable. And I'm worried about what may happen here. And most of the students seem very blasé about it. They may be atypical, but these are students who are taking a course in international relations, and you would think there would be more interest. I mean, I've been in Taiwan now for 14 years, and I almost feel like, I would join up if I could. I wouldn't be of any use to anyone.
So you feel there's a sense of urgency?
I do. I mean, the language that Xi Jinping is using is really troubling. We get ready for war, he's telling his troops. I mean, this is scary talk. And
so before we move on to the next section, Professor, you believe that there's still room, even though some say it might be the 11th hour and that U.S. capabilities are going down?
Of course we do, because you cannot rule out the possibility that the PLA will not attack Taiwan. You have to use the worst scenario to map out your strategy and your management of the relations with Beijing. That's what Taiwan ought to do.
Yeah. Let me add one point, though. What you can find are a lot of experts, commentators online who point out that for all of the growth in the size and the abilities of the Chinese military, Xi Jinping, PLA, China in general face huge problems. They've got a growing demographic problem. They're going to have increasingly fewer young working people. They've got this terrible problem that they've hooked up. Xi Jinping has insisted on a zero-tolerance COVID policy, which has been a disaster. Because of technology theft and other problems, the U.S. has basically cut them out of the advanced microchip market to the extent.
We'll talk a bit more about China in our third section.
Okay. So anyway, I think that the situation is not all that sunny for China.
We just discussed what it takes for Taiwan to come up with sufficient deterrence capability in fending off a Chinese attack and the different scenarios Taiwan may need to cope with. Let's now hear from Riley Walters, Deputy Director of the Japan Chair at the think tank Hudson Institute. I spoke to Riley earlier from Washington, D.C. on how Taiwan can work with U.S. allies in the region in the case or to deter a Taiwan contingency. Let's take a look.
Well, I think there's a few ways that the U.S. can support Taiwan. One is just coming from the American point of view is actually beefing up our own deterrence capabilities. This means increasing our own military spending, especially in things like the Navy, so we can actually have the boats to sail around the Asia Pacific. The other is, of course, supporting our partners and allies in the region. We do have quite a few strategic partners, strategic allies in the region already: Japan, South Korea, Australia, and more. And so helping them beef up their deterrence as we look toward a Taiwan contingency. And then finally, to support Taiwan directly, of course, military arms sales are important, but it's also important to think strategically. If we're just funding a major a boat, for example, helping Taiwan build a large ship of some sort, it's not thinking asymmetrically. It's not thinking about new types of warfare like that exist in, for example, the cyber domain in other ways. So we have to think a little bit more strategically, help Taiwan also plan a little bit more strategically, and of course, make sure that the funding is there, not just from the U.S. point of view, but also that Taiwan is, of course, increasing its own defense expenditures.
Riley, you talked a bit about how the U.S. is helping to beef up allies in the region. As an expert in Japan and Korea, do you see that cooperation increasing with Taiwan?
The Japanese government, for example, has been, or at least analysts in Japan have been thinking a lot more about what a Chinese invasion of Taiwan could mean for Japan and the U.S.-Japan alliance. They're thinking about, not just from a defense point of view, but also, not just from a deterrence point of view, but from also a humanitarian relief point of view. What it could mean for Japan if, for example, China were to also attack Japan in its sort of expansion into the Indo-Pacific. And so they're thinking very carefully about this and trying to partner very succinctly with the United States. The United States just came out with its national security strategy. Japan is also going to be releasing its updated national security strategy, hopefully before the end of the year. And I expect to see a lot of continuity, a lot of cohesion between these two strategic documents. I think South Korea is very preoccupied with North Korea right now, especially given all the recent missile launches. There's a lot of talk about possibly another nuclear test from North Korea. The Koreans, are very worried that things could escalate from there. The Japanese are, of course, very worried as well. But I think the Japanese, like the Americans, see North Korea as one of those sporadic threats that aren't always as existential or as common, I guess, as the growing threat that China has become.
You talked earlier about Taiwan actually beefing up its own self-defense capabilities. As it seems likely that the Republicans will win the House, at least, if not the Senate, how do you see their support in terms of beefing up Taiwan's self-defense, as they've been hard on military and been seen as more ready to take on China?
My sense of Congress, if the Republicans take the House, and even if there's a divided Congress, or if the Republicans take the House and the Senate, I do believe the Republicans are going to be a little bit more hard pressed to do something on China, to do something regarding Taiwan. For example, beefing up arms sales, increasing our own military expenditures, again, to beef up our own defensive capabilities. There's a lot of talk about, not specific for Taiwan, but more directed toward China, that, thinking about preparing sanctions, a sanctions package, for example, if China were to ever invade, sort of like how the United States and others sanctioned Russia after its illegal invasion of Ukraine, preparing for that, so that so that the U.S. government doesn't have to sort of react to the moment. It's already sort of been thought of and prepared. So that kind of thing is happening. I would also expect to see a lot more dialogue. I think, for example, Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan has really sort of set a fire under Congress. I think we've seen a lot more congressional visits. I would expect to see even more.
You just heard from Riley Walters on the importance of working with our neighbors, Taiwan, to make China think twice before attacking. We'd now like to discuss what that means and how Taiwan can work with Japan, Korea, and other U.S. Pacific allies on collective defense. Now, I'm posing my next question to Professor Huang. Professor, does Japan share the same urgency in a Chinese threat? And if they do, to what degree is it comparable to Taiwan's sense of urgency? And does it translate over to Japanese society in that, like many Japanese leaders have said, a Taiwanese contingency is a Japanese contingency?
Mm-hmm. You know, there's just a very recent poll released in mid-November about exactly the question you posed. According to the poll, I think close to 75% of Japanese surveyed said, yes, you know, the PLA conducts a special military exercise near Japan or towards Taiwan is a serious threat, or they feel serious threat to Japan. However, being asked, do you agree that the self-defense of Japan should send troops to help Taiwan defend itself? More than 70% of the people surveyed said no, or they are leaning towards no. So I think that's a very huge divergence between their urgency towards the possible future actions of the PLA and towards the possible response of the Japanese armed force. So what I mean is that, yes, I think some Japanese politicians have said once and again that Taiwan's contingency is Japan's contingency, but that's not clearly stated in Japan's official documents. And I do not think many Japanese would feel very happy to see this kind of bold statement about Japan-Taiwan security ties. Because I know Japanese, I have some Japanese friends who once joked that, okay, if there's really a war in the Taiwan Straits, then our ships can get rid of the Taiwan Strait, but take another route in the eastern side of Taiwan, and still the ships can get to Japan. Of course, he's joking, but you know that reflects some mentality of some Japanese that they feel worried about Taiwan and they feel sympathetic about Taiwan. But in terms of the real military intervention in the Taiwan Strait, I think they have to think twice because they are not facing a very small army, but the PLA. So, but again, the U.S.-Japan security alliance would probably force Japan to provide some military assistance or even direct military intervention in the Taiwan Strait. But then what will be the consequences? You know, that's a big question for the Japanese government.
Speaking of another ally, I wanted to talk about Australia. Given Ambassador Stanton, you've been there and you've been the de facto or the charge d'affaires there, running U.S. affairs in Australia. Mm-hmm. How would you see Australia's role given that the U.S. has increased its troops by tenfold in northern Australia with Perth and with the B-52s, and also there's an alleged nuclear missile now in Australia and a contingency for Taiwan?
I never heard that, but that's maybe after my time. Well, I think the Australians, of all our allies, have always proved, perhaps along with the British,
do you feel that
be the most ready to join the fight.
Would they effectively deter Xi Jinping, given might and?
I don't think so, except of course there's a new prime minister. He's recently made a statement about trying to improve relations with China, which are very bad now because China, of course, embargoed many Australian products after the Australians, quite properly, I thought, asked, and I think U.S. should have been bolder about that as well, asked for a coming clean about the cause of the virus, samples of the original virus. And the Chinese were so offended by that because, of course, they call it, and some of them have claimed that it's an American virus or it's, who knows where it's from. But the COVID-19, they just imposed all kinds of punishments that they could think of on China.
I want to go back a bit on the military aspect.
Yeah.
There's been a tenfold increase. How do you think Xi Jinping would react to that, given that the U.S. has put in recently all these resources in northern Australia?
Well, I think he'd have his hands full, actually, if the U.S. is coming into the fight. the Australians, you know, it's a big country, but it's a relatively smaller population as well. I believe the population might be even less than that of Taiwan.
About the same.
Or
About the same.
About the same. My older daughter is there now, and my granddaughter is 2 years old, so maybe it's adding to the fight. I don't know, but I think the Australians have always impressed me with their sense of courage, their willingness to join with the U.S. in battles that really were none of their concern. They were with us, for example, in wars that I didn't support. They had troops, I think, in Iraq.
So you're saying you think they would be there for Taiwan?
I think they would if the U.S. is there. I think they would support us, and I don't know if they'd put troops on the ground. I don't know if it'll come to troops on the ground. I have a feeling that this war, my own view is it'll start with things like embargoes and blockades and cyber attacks, and you know, it'll be more trying to reduce the fight here in Taiwan. And so I don't know if there'll be a casus belli, you know, a cause for war right away. But I have a lot of confidence in the Australians as allies. I've just noticed Kevin Rudd has the lead article in Foreign Affairs that I read, which the real focus is to say Xi Jinping is a true blue Marxist believer. And he's quite concerned about what that might mean. You know, he feels, it's interesting coming from him because, of course, he's been very friendly in the past, both in the government and outside of it, I believe, toward China. But even now, he's recognized the whole game has changed with Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is far more aggressive than his predecessors. We haven't seen anybody like him since, well, certainly since Mao, really. Yang was aggressive in some ways, but he was the guy who also opened up China. So, but, you know, Kevin Rudd is an Australian. He's the head of the Asia Society in New York. But for him, it's a long article, but the whole thrust of the article is be aware, be worried, get ready.
Professor Huang, what's